Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, Next Level Dex, What's Stalling Progress and How to Fix It, where we'll be discussing the outcome of our 2025 Digital Employee Experience Report. Before we get started, just a couple of notes of housekeeping. Our runtime today will be right around 30 minutes. Hopefully you are able to stay for the whole thing, but if you're not, please watch your email. We'll be sending around a recording after this airs. As you're listening, please feel free to drop any questions that you might have into the chat. If we have enough time at the end of our presentation today, we will answer those live. But for those that we don't have time to answer, we'll follow up with you over email. And finally, I would like to draw your attention to the additional resources that you can see in your webinar player. These include a link to the research that we'll be discussing today. So if you haven't had a chance to read that, highly encourage it, as well as a couple of other related resources. So let me introduce our speakers today. Joining us, we have Rob May, who is the founder and executive chairman of Ramsack and an expert in AI and cybersecurity. He is joined by Ivanti's own Mariah, who is the product marketing manager for our digital employee experience solution. Mariah, I will hand it over to you to get us started.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Rob, happy to be chatting with you today. And to kind of kick things off, I wanted to briefly talk about what we mean when we say digital employee experience. Obviously, there's Dex software, but what we're talking about in our research is Dex as a concept, which is much bigger than just software. So how would you kind of explain that simply?
Okay, and I think this is a really important thing to start with, actually, because I found that when I'm talking about Dex, which I'm really passionate about, people aren't really sure what it is. And so to summarize, Dex is the sum of all the different ways that any user interacts with the workplace technology that we give them as employers. So that's from logging on each morning to accessing apps or receiving support or waiting for something to load, whatever, how often they have to change their password, you get the idea. But I think some days that experience is smooth and others it's really frustrating. The thing is, the experience of using the tools that we give people shapes how they feel about their work, how productive they can be, and whether or not they feel supported. And where Dex Systems comes in is in giving IT visibility into that experience. And if we've got visibility, then we can measure it and we can improve it and ultimately design for it. But I think the confusion happens when organizations buy a Dex tool and then they think that that means they have a strategy. But a tool isn't a strategy. Dex needs leadership, clarity, and measurable goals. Otherwise, it's just, one of those box ticked, but without any impact.
Yeah, and to your point, I think it's a real important distinction to look at, how someone or an organization is measuring Dex. And if it is being dictated by their existing tools, then that's something that needs to be reevaluated and it should be led with strategy and focused on finding tools and solutions that support the vision and the plan instead of the reverse. And I think overall leaders need to care about Dex, especially in the IT org, because it's really important to have an aligned and clear strategy for Dex within an organization. Otherwise, if there's misalignment, that can pose a risk or a threat to the entire employee experience for all employees across the board and negatively impact so many areas when it comes to productivity, turnover, KPI, security, things like that. There's a lot of areas where there would be very much unintended consequences of ignoring providing a good digital employee experience.
Absolutely. I think it's about making every digital interaction count, for everyone.
So moving on to my next question, a point that has come out of our research on several years of these surveys is that there is consistently a disconnect between beliefs about Dex and actual adoption of a Dex strategy, a large majority of respondents are saying that Dex has a positive impact, but at the same time, more than half of our respondents are saying that leaders at their organization say they value Dex, but in reality are doing very little to support it. What's going on that makes it so hard to translate these beliefs into action?
Right, and for me, this stood out in the latest report as, you know, the biggest contradiction. And I think in many cases, people are buying a solution and assuming that it's enough. But Dex has to be monitored, measured, and actively improved. 65% of IT professionals say that Dex takes a backseat because day-to-day operations are too demanding. So this isn't about intent, it's about bandwidth. And that's why strategy matters. You've got to have metrics, you've got to have accountability and space to act. Otherwise, Dex is going to stay in the nice to have category when it really needs to be a priority.
Yes, so there's definitely a huge need for metrics in order to show the impact of providing a good digital employee experience and demonstrating how that in turn provides value. But there's a lot of difficulty in obtaining these metrics, and whether that's because of fragmented data or data silos, subjective experiences, like how are you accounting for qualitative data, because that is important to measure as well. And overall, just lack of standardized definitions, integration complexity with the rest of your tools or tech stack. And also, not to mention that what quote unquote good looks like is subjective, but you can align on key indicators of what a perceived good Dex at your organization is and start socializing that between IT and security teams, whether that's, kind of starting with insights you're already probably tracking, like IT tickets created, escalated, resolution time, patch rollout. All these things will give you insight into the user experience. It's just kind of changing how you've been using them historically.
Yeah, I agree. And I think if you don't have data, if you don't have the data and ownership, then nothing really changes.
Definitely. There's, I think, a huge consequence, unintended or otherwise, when it comes to measuring accurately and monitoring the digital employee experience through that data. So continuing on, in our research, we asked respondents to rate their level of Dex maturity overall and on several different domains that fall under the Dex umbrella. And something interesting that we saw was that while most respondents, 67%, claimed moderate to high maturity levels, we still see comparatively low levels of Dex monitoring. What do you think the disconnect is there?
I think this is a classic overestimation gap, and true maturity means looking at experience from the ground up. So device level metrics, application performance, and user sentiment all linked back to business outcomes. So that's not just about having monitoring tools. It's about knowing both what to measure, but also how to act on it. There's no point measuring it if you're not going to do something. And tech companies are further ahead, but the report also showed that, government and healthcare and so on still have a long way to go. But across the board, I think we've got to move from assumption to insight. Yeah, if you can't see the experience, if you can't measure the experience, you can't improve it.
Definitely. And I think part of that is, to your point of so many things can be measured in this instance because so many things can relate to Dex and be considered a Dex activity. And I think when looking at or considering why we're seeing such high ratings and comparatively low levels of Dex monitoring, that overestimation here is a big problem because might think you're measuring, but are you measuring effectively? Because even if you are measuring things like Dex score, how is that calculated? How is that being measured? So even within these different metrics that there are to look at, there's so much variation. I mentioned earlier, like qualitative versus quantitative. How is qualitative accounted for at all? Like, it's very important to also consider the sentiment around how people are feeling about their experiences that they're having with their devices overall. And so if there's not a good way to capture that and then act on it, to your point, there's a lot of value that's lost there. And there's, so many opportunities for those metrics to have an impact, that it's such a real disservice to not be effectively measuring and monitoring them.
Yeah, fully agree.
So an interesting point in the research was the interplay between Dex and security, with 89% of respondents saying that prioritizing Dex has a positive impact on security because it makes it less likely employees will use unsafe workarounds to get their jobs done. Could you talk a little bit about how these two things come together?
For sure. And I think this is one of the most under-recognized links. The reality is, when digital experience is poor, people will look for workarounds, and that creates risk. 27% of employees said that they used unauthorized tools or apps out of frustration. And that's a security risk hiding in plain sight. Prioritizing Dex actually supports secure behavior by making it easier to use approved tools. It also, of course, creates a shared view between IT support and security teams by using common data and avoiding the silos that you talked about previously. Better employee experience and better equals better experience equals better behavior. And that then gives us better alignment between teams. We've got to, part of the whole Dex process is about recognizing and removing friction in a user's day-to-day process. And wherever there is friction, people will find workarounds because, they want to get their job done and they want an easy life. And that's where the security risk comes if it's not done properly.
Yeah. And I think that is such a widely underappreciated angle in general, because it's such a human thing that I think a lot of people can relate to, especially if you just think about it for a few minutes. It's not that bad experiences necessarily lead people to go intentionally do unsafe things because they're, irritated. It's more innocuous than that. It's just how using my personal device, or, logging in when it's convenient, but I'm on an unsafe Wi-Fi, things like that, that it's not necessarily an immediate red flag to the user of what they're doing is not secure, but would be to the security team. And because of that, I think Dex should be viewed as a bridge between the IT and security team, giving them both visibility and understanding into like what each team is looking at and how what one is doing impacts the other. And, whether that's visibility into like physically the devices and the hardware, what's going on in the ecosystem, like what software is being run on them, and how that data then translates into the user experience. And then conversely, how do security changes and policies influence the digital experience? Does that create friction that the security team isn't aware of, and they might, change their policies to adjust that as needed? So I think there's a lot of intertwinement here that gets undervalued in terms of how it can benefit the org as a whole, but especially IT and security teams.
Yeah, and I think people get stuck in discussing the theory or think that this is too difficult to comprehend or whatever. And I tend to remind people about what happened when we had COVID and all of a sudden people went from working in the office to working remotely, and the tools and the systems that people had got in place had to change overnight, and they weren't rolled out properly because of that, because everybody was responding on the fly. But that massively increased the attack surface for cyber criminals, and everybody suffered because of that. And what we need to do is learn from those lessons and remember what it was like back then, because the advancement in tech is constantly changing, and it's like that all the time, but in small slices. And it's just being mindful of that and what the risks are.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, especially when we're able to look kind of retroactively at, COVID, for example, and how the response to that. And I think it's pretty clear that the companies that work are already ahead of the game when it came to having Dex be a priority, and we're, monitoring it and focused on providing a good digital employee experience. They were the ones that had the easiest transition. So whether it's an unforeseen pandemic or just change in policy of allowing remote work, like being able to pivot like that is a huge point, or a huge result of actively being proactive when it comes to providing a good digital employee experience. So moving on to my next point is the AI of it all. It's kind of hard to talk about anything in IT right now without AI coming up. And we've seen in our research that many service desks are bogged down by issues that make it hard to deliver a great digital experience. But they are also prime candidates for AI and automation to help solve. What's the opportunity here?
I think AI has a huge potential to improve the digital experience, but only if we approach it properly. The goal should never be to add AI for the sake of adding AI. It's the goal is to embed AI into workflows so that issues are solved before they become problems, and employees can help themselves through smart service. So, this takes pressure off of service desks, and it gives IT teams more time to innovation. But the foundations have to be there. Without strong integration and rebuilt workflows, AI projects will fail. Gartner expects 40% of agentic AI initiatives will be cancelled by 2026 for exactly that reason. We have to understand why we're doing AI, what we're trying to achieve, and it's not just about doing it for the sake of doing it.
Yeah, I think that's a huge key point to focus on, is not adding AI just because we can or shoving it wherever we think it might work, but instead really focus on rebuilding workflows that encompass AI or include AI, from the ground up, and thinking about the workflow as a whole when it comes to successful AI integration. I think will be major here. The human experience when it comes to using these tools is also really important to talk about and consider, especially when it's not an uncommon sentiment of employees can be resistant to AI, or they have concerns over AI. So considering them from the beginning is going to get you buy-in from your people, and it's going to help make the most successful AI adoption that you can have. So just, yeah, focusing from rebuilding existing workflows as a whole, and not just shoving AI where you can just to use it, I think is the most important takeaway here.
I agree. I think as well, it's worth saying I've been involved in lots of AI projects, and sometimes when we start to talk about the fact that we're introducing AI, you get pushback. And for me, I change the narrative, and when we're talking about AI and you're getting pushback, I change the narrative from not talking about artificial intelligence but reframing it as introducing assistive intelligence. And what we're talking about is having assistive intelligence in the process. And it's not a patch, but when it comes to Dex, it's not a patch. It has to be part of that process, and that lands much better, I think.
Continuing on with AI, where do we see Dex evolving in the coming years, especially around AI adoption becoming more widespread?
Okay, I think for me, the future of Dex is predictive, not reactive. I think we'll see more real-time analytics, sentiment insights, and AI-powered recommendations that will allow IT to fix problems before they impact productivity. That then opens the door for CIOs to properly lead at a strategic level. And when you connect experience to performance, retention and business value, Dex becomes a board level discussion. It also shifts IT's role from firefighting to future building, and that's a really powerful evolution.
Yes, I definitely think, to your point of focusing on predictive problem solving, like there's always going to be a need for, the firefighting, for the reactive. But instead, if we can focus on preventing that from the beginning by way of creating new workflows and leveraging strong AI and automation tools, then we can systematize kind of the approach to these issues where a large percentage of them are solved or become non-issues because they're solved right away. They're solved proactively, which then gives time back for larger, more important tasks that the IT team can focus on. And I think overall, if we can kind of flip the narrative of AI and how it can focus on creating new types of jobs in IT admin with new roles evolving to support Dex, especially in an organization, that will help get more people excited about it, and you'll see more successful adoption because of it.
Yes, I do think there's still this fundamental issue as well of, leadership need to know that all of this, the whole Dex piece is about ensuring that they've got happy staff, and happy staff impacts all of their results. We all know what it's like when you have a bad IT day. It impacts everything. So leadership need to understand that this is what they're investing in, because it impacts everything that people sat in the C-suite are interested in. There's a direct correlation.
Yeah, I don't think that can be overstated enough. Yell it from the rooftops. um, so, kind of wrapping up, if you had to give one piece of advice to our audience about improving their Dex maturity, what would that be? And kind of twofold, where should they focus in the short term and where should they focus in the long term?
Short term, start with visibility. Do you know what you're monitoring today? And if not, that's the first step. Dex needs to be seen before it can be improved. Long term, tie Dex outcomes to the things that the business already cares about. So tie it to productivity and employee retention or client retention, staff satisfaction. That is how you get support, investment, and traction in a Dex project.
Yes, I think to your point about short-term visibility, it's the first step. You cannot really expect to have any impactful discussions without it, or actually leverage your data impactfully, or trust your data to be impactful in that way, because we know we see this as one of the questions in our research about how people are managing their asset inventory, and spreadsheets year over year is still a chunk of of the way that people are monitoring. So if you can't know like real time what devices, every single device that's in your ecosystem, then you have no way of ensuring that someone's having a good experience on that device, the same way you can't ensure that it's being used safely, being used properly. So I think if you don't have good visibility, then that's exactly where you have to start no matter what. And that cannot be overstated enough, the value of understanding and knowing everything that's in your IT ecosystem. And to your point about long term and initiatives being tied to outcomes that matter when it comes to Dex, is like, we've touched on this a lot, but I think the reinforcement is important here, that Dex affects everyone and everything beyond tech. It's not just your average Joe being irritated because his computer's slow. It's those unsafe workarounds. It's how bogged down the service desk is. It's patches being rolled out and then causing an issue later on that no one knows about because there's no sort of follow-up. So there's a lot that goes into it. And when we're accurately, monitoring and measuring these things that go into providing a good digital employee experience, those results, or what we're seeing as a result, those benefits are the more secure, the happier employees, the higher productivity, a less stressed service desk that's able to focus on, much more strategic initiatives, we'll say. So I think the reinforcement of overall that.
Yeah, absolutely. Make it visible, make it measurable, and tie it to the outcomes that matter. And then it moves from being optional to being mission critical.
All right, we have time for one question from the audience. So, Rob, Mariah, I will throw this out to you. Where are you seeing IT teams have the most success with AI today?
I think for me, it goes back to the assistive piece that we were just talking about, where we're using tools to help the help desk to see what the problem is, but not just see what the problem is, but link it to other patterns elsewhere. You could have a user who's got a problem and they speak to help desk, and the person on the help desk solves the problem. Now, what AI can do is link that and say, do you know that somebody else in that team or at that site also has the same problem, or they reported the same issue 5 minutes ago? And AI, I think, really helps join the dots, and that brings efficiency and patterns. And I think that's really impactful.
I think, in addition to Rob's point, where AI especially is being most impactful for service desks is those that have been able to leverage it for that proactive remediation. So whether that is having, scans that are automatically detecting device issues and sending, bots or agents out to solve them before the user is even able to report an experience, that's like the best case scenario, that for everyone, it's caught early, it's treated, it's not had time to cause digital friction, even nonetheless security issues, and it's just kind of like maintains the status quo of no digital friction for the user, and the IT person isn't having all these unnecessary tickets. So any time that it can be used in that proactive way, I think is majorly beneficial.
Another idea another example that popped into my head when you were talking is things like impossible travel, for example. So the concept that you've got a user and they've been in the office all day in New York, and yet half an hour later, after the end of the day, they're trying to log in Moscow. The two things are impossible, but AI detects that impossible travel and says, we've got an issue, let's respond to that. And again, that's another great way that we can help protect.
That's such a good example, and not something that will cause an issue until way later on, until it's a really big issue. So being able to catch that early and treat it is key.
Right. Well, Rob, Mariah, thank you both. Those are all the questions that we have time for today. So for those of you who asked questions that we did not get a chance to answer, we'll be following up with you over email. Before we go, just one more plug. Take a look at the related resources section. You can get the link to the survey data that we talked about today. Thank you all so much for joining us.